Welcome back to The Dark Tales. Tonight, we journey not just into the darkness of history, but into the darkness of the American soul, a darkness born of fear, religious fanaticism, and the systemic cruelty of slavery. You think you know the story of the Salem Witch Trials, a terrifying tale of mass hysteria, spectral evidence, and innocent people hanged on Gallows Hill. But the story America has largely chosen to forget, the one buried beneath 2 centuries of sanitized history books, is the story of the one woman who was the true catalyst for the entire disaster, the one who was literally the first name spoken in the most infamous court proceedings on this continent. Her name was Tituba, a name that echoes from the shadows, a name synonymous with magic and malice, yet a name attached to a human being whose true ordeal was far more complex and heartbreaking than any sensationalized account of witchcraft. She was an enslaved woman, trafficked from her homeland, stripped of her identity, and ultimately forced to become the literal scapegoat for an entire colony's psychological breakdown. This isn't just a story about a Puritan village and a moral panic. This is the untold narrative of America's original sin and how it intersects with the very foundations of the nation's legal and social systems. How could one enslaved woman, likely of Caribbean or South American descent, possess the power to ignite such an inferno that consumed 20 innocent lives? The simple, brutal answer is, she didn't. But the power dynamic surrounding her, the fear she induced simply by being different, the inherent vulnerability of her position as property in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, made her the perfect target, and her testimony, forced under duress and terror, was the match that lit the kindling of fear. Stay with me, because over the next 40 minutes we are going to meticulously piece together the terrifying, true events that led to a slave becoming the central yet marginalized figure in the greatest judicial atrocity in North American history. We will explore the chilling psychological and cultural reasons why the testimony of an enslaved person was not only accepted but embraced by the ruling elite of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and why her fate, unlike almost all the others, remains one of the most mysterious and haunting disappearances from the historical record. This is the tale of Tituba, the witch trial story America never wanted told. Before we can understand Tituba's unique and tragic role, we must first understand the suffocating environment in which she was forced to live. We need to set the stage for the kindling of Salem. The Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1692 was a place defined by unyielding religious orthodoxy and profound anxiety. These were Puritans, a people who believed themselves to be God's chosen few, establishing a city upon a hill. Yet they were constantly terrified that God's wrath was just a misstep away. Their life was a relentless cycle of hard labor, strict moral codes, and the pervasive belief that the devil was a real, tangible entity actively working in the world around them. This was not the quaint, settled New England of later periods. Salem Village, specifically, was a pressure cooker. It was a small, agrarian community, geographically isolated and riddled with bitter, long-standing interpersonal and land disputes. It was literally split between the prosperous, mercantile Salem town and the more conservative, struggling farming community of Salem Village. These feuds weren't just petty squabbles. They were moral, religious, and economic conflicts that simmered for decades. Furthermore, the region had recently experienced political upheaval, having lost its original charter, leading to a period of governmental instability. They were also constantly on edge due to recent bloody conflicts with Native American tribes on the frontier, a stark reminder of the wilderness that pressed against their civilized existence, a wilderness they believed was literally inhabited by the devil and his agents. It is into this volatile mix of religious extremism, governmental uncertainty, economic envy, and genuine external threat that Tituba was dropped, a living representation of everything the Puritans feared and reviled, a person of color, a slave, and an outsider who brought with her the rumored, terrifying knowledge of non-Christian spiritual practices. Her presence in the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris was already a disruption, a crack in the carefully controlled facade of Puritan purity a crack that was about to shatter the entire society. This foundational tension is crucial because it was not Tituba's actions alone, but the deep-seated fears of a crumbling society that gave her actions, or alleged actions, their terrifying weight and power. The stage was set for a nightmare. Within this fraught environment, the household of Reverend Samuel Parris became ground zero for the catastrophe. Parris, himself a former merchant who had failed in Barbados and only recently taken up the ministry, was a controversial and divisive figure in the village. He was already embroiled in salary disputes and other local quarrels, making his home a nexus of tension and gossip. Tituba was part of his household as a slave, a human being held as property, whose origins, though debated by historians, likely placed her as either a South American Arawak woman captured in the British West Indies, or possibly an African woman with indigenous heritage. Regardless of her precise origin, what is undisputed is that she was not a part of the Puritan world. She was an outsider in the most profound sense, lacking the rights and protections afforded even the lowest-class free person. Parris also owned Tituba's husband, John Indian, another enslaved person. Her life, therefore, was one of total subjugation, forced labor, and constant surveillance by a household that viewed her culture and her very existence with suspicion. It is within this suffocating atmosphere that the spark was struck. The Parris household included Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. It is a simple, human need to seek out comfort and entertainment, and the girls, confined by the severe strictures of Puritan life, began gathering around Tituba, coaxing her to share tales and perform small acts of divination and fortune-telling, which were common cultural practices in her original home but strictly forbidden under Puritan law. They were looking for a thrill, a glimpse into the future, perhaps to know whom they might marry or what fortunes awaited them. Tituba, possibly seeking a moment of connection or agency in her otherwise powerless existence, indulged them. The initial acts were innocuous, perhaps involving the infamous Venus glass, an egg white dropped in water to reveal images, but they were acts that crossed the line from curiosity into forbidden magic, laying the groundwork for the terrifying accusations that would follow and providing the legal fodder necessary for the local authorities to launch their destructive investigation. The true nature of the events that transpired in that Parris kitchen is layered and complex, moving quickly from innocent parlor games to something far more sinister. In January of 1692, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began exhibiting strange and violent fits. They would scream uncontrollably, contort their bodies into impossible shapes, and throw objects around the room. They complained of being pricked, pinched, and bitten by unseen forces. Modern interpretation suggests this could have been a host of medical issues, ranging from ergot poisoning, a fungus on rye grain that causes convulsions, to severe psychological distress and conversion disorder fueled by the overwhelming societal pressure of Puritan life. But in 17th century Salem, there was only one plausible explanation: witchcraft. The local minister and the concerned adults were convinced that the girls were being afflicted by the devil's agents. The community was desperate for an answer, a person to blame, and the doctor, William Griggs, confirmed their deepest fears by diagnosing the girls as being under an evil hand. This diagnosis, made by the single authority figure they trusted on such matters, was essentially a death sentence for someone. The hysteria now had medical and religious validation, and all that remained was to identify the wicked souls who were torturing these innocent children. In a desperate, misguided attempt to alleviate the girls' suffering, and perhaps to reveal the witch, a neighbor, Mary Sibley, encouraged Tituba and John Indian to bake a witch cake, a concoction of rye meal and the girls' urine, which was then fed to a dog, based on an Old English folk remedy believed to counteract a spell. This act, intended as a cure, immediately backfired and was interpreted by Reverend Parris as a clear, damning sign of occult knowledge and direct involvement in the forbidden art of magic, effectively sealing Tituba's fate. They didn't just need a witch, they needed a convenient witch, a powerless scapegoat whose accusation wouldn't challenge the fundamental power structures of the community. And the enslaved woman, Tituba, who had already performed small acts of forbidden divination, was the perfect, terrifyingly available choice to bear the weight of their collective fear and hysteria, thus transitioning the village from merely being afraid of the devil to actively hunting his earthly representatives. With the community clamoring for names and the afflicted girls pointing their fingers, Tituba, John Indian, and another marginalized woman, Sarah Good, a poor, homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, sickly woman who had scandalously married her indentured servant, were the very first individuals arrested and brought before the magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, on March 1, 1692. This selection, immediately bypassing any prominent or wealthy citizens, underscores the classist and racist nature of the emerging tragedy. However, the initial interrogation of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne followed the standard pattern: vehement denial. These denials, coupled with their low social standing, provided the magistrates with little conclusive proof to move the case forward in the charged atmosphere. The court needed a breakthrough, a confession that would validate their fears and the entire judicial process. All eyes then turned to Tituba, who was subjected to a far more brutal and psychologically coercive interrogation than her co-accused. It is here that the intersection of slavery, race, and gender created a perfect storm of vulnerability. Tituba was not only questioned for days, but was almost certainly subjected to severe physical abuse and psychological torture. She was denied legal counsel. She was surrounded by hostile, white, Puritan men who held total power over her life and death, and she was likely shown the fate that awaited those who simply denied the accusations, a fate that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were destined for. The magistrates were practically handing her the script, promising her mercy and salvation if she would confess to being the devil's servant and, critically, name other co-conspirators. They needed her to confirm the existence of a grand satanic plot, a tangible evil that justified their entire witch hunt, and a simple denial from a slave would not be enough to satisfy the bloodlust of the increasingly fearful community. The true turning point, the moment that irrevocably set the Salem Witch Trials into motion, came when Tituba finally broke under the pressure and delivered one of the most sensational and terrifying confessions in colonial history. On March 19, 1692, Tituba testified that she had been approached by a tall, dark man, the devil himself, who promised her many fine things if she would serve him. What is critical to understand is that her confession was a brilliant, culturally savvy performance, tailored precisely to the Puritan mindset, transforming her testimony from a simple statement of guilt into a vivid, horrifying narrative of a vast, organized, satanic conspiracy. She spoke of riding through the air on a pole, meeting with the devil, and seeing a large black book containing the names of 9 witches who had signed their names in blood. She described animals that accompanied the devil, including a yellow bird and a black dog, and recounted seeing the shapes of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne pinching the afflicted girls. By weaving in details that were deeply familiar to the European folklore of witchcraft, the black man, the familiar spirits, the witch's book, she gave the Puritans exactly what they believed to be true: confirmation of a genuine, organized coven operating in their midst. However, she masterfully used her confession as a weapon of self-preservation. She did not simply confess to being a witch, she confessed, but then claimed to be acting under duress and stated that her main goal was actually to stop the afflictions. By becoming a confessing witch who repented and cooperated, she provided the court with the crucial validation it needed, and in return she secured a temporary reprieve from the gallows. This powerful, dramatic testimony, delivered by a woman who was supposed to be completely powerless, was the definitive catalyst that shattered all remaining skepticism and unleashed the full fury of the witch hunt upon the broader community, convincing everyone that the threat was not only real, but massive and required immediate aggressive action to eradicate the evil. The immediate, devastating consequence of Tituba's confession was the legitimization of the spectral evidence and the rapid expansion of the accusations. Spectral evidence, which was testimony by the afflicted victims that they had been tormented by the spectre, or spiritual shape of the accused, was the highly controversial linchpin of the trials. Tituba's testimony, coming from an alleged inside source, a repentant witch, made the spectral evidence of the girls seem entirely credible and undeniable to the magistrates and the jury. If Tituba could ride on a pole and cause harm, then the girls' claims that the specters of others were tormenting them must also be true. Crucially, Tituba's testimony gave the girls the courage, the precedent, and the framework to name more socially significant people. Tituba had only named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, the outcasts, but the girls, now armed with the court's validation, moved quickly up the social ladder, eventually naming revered, upstanding church members like Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If the devil could enlist an enslaved woman, how much more successful would he be in corrupting the souls of the most respected members of the community? The dam of disbelief had broken, and the torrent of accusations that followed swept away innocent people from all walks of life, from ministers and wealthy merchants to poor farmers and single mothers. Tituba's confession fundamentally transformed the scope of the trials from a localized incident involving 3 marginalized women into a colony-wide crisis that ultimately led to the imprisonment of over 200 people and the execution of 20 innocent men and women. Her coerced words, born of a desperate will to survive slavery and torture, became the rhetorical and legal foundation upon which the entire tragedy was built. This is the darkest irony of the Salem tragedy. The most powerless person in the colony was forced to provide the testimony that empowered the authorities to commit the greatest abuse of power in their history. It is paramount to pause here and consider the source material itself, a document that reveals the chilling extent of the psychological manipulation Tituba endured. If one reads the original court transcript of her examination, the voice of the slave is almost entirely absent, replaced by the leading questions and interpretations of the magistrates. For example, when Tituba initially speaks, she often uses language that suggests she was merely shown the devil's book or told what to do by the black man, framing her actions as compelled rather than willing. However, the relentless questioning is designed to push her toward using the language of willing participation. The magistrates did not want to hear about compulsion. They wanted a collaborator. Furthermore, the transcription itself is selective, focusing only on the sensational details that support the conspiracy theory. It's a chilling record of power actively manufacturing consent and testimony. She was asked repeatedly about the names in the devil's book, an interrogation technique designed solely to gather more alleged co-conspirators. It is through this textual lens that we understand the true genius of her survival strategy. She gave them spectacle, she gave them horror, but she named only the 2 people she had already been implicitly forced to name, the 2 social outcasts, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, thereby confirming the devil's plot without personally expanding the net to engulf others. Her confession became a protective shield. By confessing and confirming the Puritan worldview, she was spared the denial-based path to the gallows. While others were hanged for denying their pact with the devil, Tituba was saved for admitting hers. This survival mechanism, born of trauma and extreme duress, ensured that while the others faced the hangman's noose, Tituba simply moved from one form of captivity to another, awaiting her final, mysterious fate. The question of why Tituba confessed remains one of the most compelling ethical and historical puzzles of the entire episode. Was she a true believer in the occult who genuinely felt she was serving a dark power, or was she a shrewd survivor who knew exactly how to play the game of her oppressors? Given her likely cultural background, which embraced folk magic and spiritualism in a way the Puritans forbade, it's possible her initial storytelling was rooted in a genuine spiritual practice. However, her detailed, folklore-rich confession was undeniably an act of calculated self-preservation. Let's be clear, as an enslaved woman, she was subjected to a system that legally permitted physical violence and even death at the hands of her master. When confronted by the magistrates, Tituba had no power, no rights, and no one to defend her. Her choice was not between telling the truth and lying, Her choice was between a denial that guaranteed a swift trip to the gallows, as her co-accused would soon find out, and a confession that, based on English legal precedent, offered the possibility of mercy and preservation of life. She chose life, and to secure it, she leveraged her knowledge as an outsider. She knew the white man's fear of the dark wilderness and the devil, and she expertly crafted a tale that would satisfy the magistrate's need for dramatic proof and confirm their own profound religious biases. The devil, she described, was not a mere literary concept. He was a literal, contract-signing figure who represented the opposite of the Puritan God, making her story compellingly credible to her judges. This confession was a remarkable act of psychological jujitsu, turning her powerlessness into a temporary, life-saving form of power. She realized that in the eyes of her Puritan masters, the only acceptable defense for a woman of her background would be full cooperation and repentance, not a defiant assertion of innocence, which would only be seen as further evidence of the devil's stubborn influence. The role of psychological coercion in Tituba's confession cannot be overstated. The historical record strongly suggests that Reverend Paris himself, Tituba's owner, played a direct and deeply compromised role in forcing her confession. Paris, facing immense pressure to deal with the hysteria that had erupted in his own home, reportedly beat Tituba until she confessed. This physical violence, combined with the extreme psychological pressure of the jail and the leading questions from the magistrates, leaves little doubt that her confession was obtained under duress and therefore has no ethical or historical standing as a genuine admission of guilt. Paris had a vested interest in securing Tituba's confession. If the afflictions of the girls were due to natural causes or the emotional fallout of his own divisive ministry, his reputation would be ruined. But if they were caused by a slave in his household who was secretly serving the devil, Paris became a victim and a righteous defender of the faith, exonerating him and his family from any personal or ministerial culpability. His role was crucial. He controlled Tituba's life, he administered the violence, and he likely directed the content of the confession to some degree, ensuring it served his personal and professional interests by validating the witchcraft narrative. Moreover, Tituba's confession served as a bizarre form of temporary elevation. For a brief period, this enslaved woman, otherwise invisible and voiceless, became the most important person in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the central witness whose words held the power of life and death over others. Her performance, though coerced, granted her a temporary form of agency, transforming her from silent property into a pivotal, dramatic figure on the stage of colonial history. She chose a path where she would be deemed a collaborator with the devil rather than a martyr to his cause, a difficult but entirely rational choice for a woman fighting for survival against insurmountable odds in a hostile land. To further solidify the complex reality of her testimony, consider the sheer emotional and physical trauma of imprisonment itself. While her co-accused, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, denied their guilt and were quickly moved through the legal process toward execution, Tituba, as a confessed witch, remained in jail for over a year, long after the height of the hysteria had passed. Tituba's stay in prison was lengthy because, according to colonial law, jailers were not compensated by the state. Rather, they charged the imprisoned individuals for their room, board, and shackles. Since Tituba was property and not a free person, the legal responsibility for her release lay with her owner, Reverend Samuel Paris. Paris, having used her confession to save his own reputation and validate the entire witch hunt, then callously refused to pay the high jail fees necessary to release his own slave. Having served his purpose, Tituba was left to languish in the miserable conditions of the Boston jail, a forgotten pawn in a game of power and theology. The emotional and physical toll of this prolonged incarceration, following the initial violence and interrogation, underscores the utter inhumanity of her treatment. This refusal by Paris is perhaps the most damning indictment of his character and the colonial system itself. The man who leveraged her agony for his professional gain ultimately abandoned her to a fate worse than a quick death, a prolonged, costly, and painful captivity. This period in jail represents the final, tragic chapter of her recognized legal ordeal, highlighting how the colonial system, even when it ostensibly granted mercy, only did so within the cruel economic framework of slavery, ensuring her suffering continued long after the trials had officially ended. The Salem Witch Trials formally ended in May of 1693, when Governor William Phipps, whose own wife had been accused, dissolved the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer and pardoned all those remaining in jail. It was a necessary, though politically motivated, admission of judicial error. This change in the political climate should have meant Tituba's immediate release, but the issue of her jail fees remained. As a piece of property, she could not pay the fees herself, and Reverend Parris steadfastly refused to do so. For an undisclosed period, Tituba remained the property of the jailer until, finally, a mysterious, unnamed person intervened. The historical records show that in 1693, an anonymous individual purchased Tituba from Reverend Parris for the price of her outstanding jail fees and took her away, effectively purchasing her freedom from that specific ordeal, though not from the institution of slavery itself. And just like that, Tituba vanished entirely from the historical record. We do not know the identity of her new owner, where she was taken, what her new life entailed, or when and where she died. Her disappearance is profoundly symbolic. The woman whose testimony began the greatest tragedy in colonial America simply stepped back into the shadows of the enslaved population from which she came, her narrative swallowed by the history that preferred to focus on the respectable white victims. This anonymity is not an accident. It is the deliberate erasure of the life of an enslaved person whose identity was deemed disposable once her utility as a scapegoat had expired. Her story ends not with a grand conclusion, but with a profound and frustrating silence, a deliberate gap in the archives that forces us to reckon with the systemic racism that underpinned the entire colonial project and her crucial role within it. Tituba's enduring legacy is complicated, often romanticized, and frequently misunderstood. In popular culture, she is often depicted as a powerful, exotic, or malevolent figure, a caricature that perpetuates the very same fearful stereotypes that led to her initial persecution. She is frequently imagined as a full-blooded African woman practicing voodoo, a conflation of different cultures and spiritual traditions that serves only to sensationalize the story and ignore the historical complexities of her probable South American or Caribbean indigenous background. This fictionalized Tituba, first popularized by the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and later immortalized by Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, is a figure of dramatic convenience, an archetype of the other who brought chaos to the pure community. But the real legacy of Tituba is far more profound and instructive. Her story is a necessary mirror that reflects the brutal intersection of power, race, and religion in early America. It serves as a potent reminder that the Salem Witch Trials were not just about superstitious beliefs. They were about social stratification, economic anxiety, and the readiness of a dominant culture to blame and persecute the most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the old, and especially the enslaved person of color. The fact that a slave's word, when aligned with the agenda of the elite, could send upstanding citizens to the gallows underscores the perverse nature of power in a slave-holding society. Tituba's life reveals that her greatest act was not witchcraft, but an act of sheer, desperate survival, a masterclass in psychological manipulation performed by a woman with no formal power, a performance that allowed her to walk away while others were hanged. This is the narrative that must be told. The story of an enslaved woman who was the hinge of history, forced to open the door to mass hysteria. As we close this dark chapter on the dark tales. The chilling silence surrounding Tituba's final fate speaks volumes about America's historical priorities. We meticulously archive the trials, the confessions, the deaths, and the subsequent retractions of the white accused. Yet the woman who began it all is dismissed with a brief final ledger entry about a sale. Historian Elaine Breslaw noted that the very complexity of Tituba's probable indigenous identity, combined with her enslaved status, made her a figure of profound fear and fascination for the Puritans, a living embodiment of the demonic wilderness they sought to tame. This is the core truth we must take away. The Salem Witch Trials were a spectacular public failure of justice, but for Tituba, they were a private, existential horror. Her story serves as a perennial warning about the dangers of unchecked religious and legal authority, the terrifying power of scapegoating, and the enduring tragedy of systemic racism that can erase a life even after it has become pivotal to a national narrative. The true witch was the system that enslaved her, beat her, coerced her testimony, and then discarded her. We can honor her memory not by perpetuating the fictional, sensationalized witch, but by demanding that her true, traumatic, and survival-driven story of a slave woman's ordeal be placed front and center, finally giving voice to the woman America never wanted to acknowledge. The dark tales. We'll always seek out the truths buried beneath the convenient narratives. Thank you for joining us on this difficult journey. Until next time, stay vigilant.